Good morning, everybody, and happy Easter, happy Passover, happy spring. We welcome as our speaker today a dear friend of our society and the Vedanta family in general, Dr. Jeffery Long, the Carl W. Zeigler Professor of Religious Studies at Elizabethtown College, Pennsylvania. Dr. Long's graduate degree is from the University of Chicago Divinity School. In 2018, Dr. Long received the Hindu American Foundation's Dharma Savor Award for his efforts to help Americans understand Hinduism in academia and public schools. He's a longtime practitioner of Vedanta and the author of many books on Jainism, Hinduism, and more. His two most recently published books are Indian Philosophy, an Introduction, published last year, and Nonviolence in the World's Religions, published in 2021. And another of Dr. Long's books, Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds, just recently received a book award from the Dharma Academy of North America. The subject of his talk today is What Makes the Four Yogas Work, Vivekananda's philosophy of yogic pluralism. There will be time for a Q&A afterwards, and I think everybody knows that Dr. Long loves having questions, so please come on up. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and namaste, namaskar, good morning to everyone here. We've had this is a very sacred time. We just had Ram Navami a few days ago, and then Hanuman Jayanti, and then in the Jain tradition, Mahavir Jayanti, Passover is going on, Ramadan is going on, and Happy Easter. So I hope I've covered everyone. That's a lot that's going on at this time. I want to thank you all for, in the words of Swami Vivekananda, your warm and cordial welcome. I'm always grateful to speak here at the Vedanta Society of New York. I always feel at home, and I'm honored and privileged to be able to share my thoughts with you in this sacred setting in the presence of Thakur Ma and Swamiji, and to see so many good friends and familiar faces today, and some new friends too. In my presentation today, I'm going to share with you my own understanding of the four yogas as taught by Swami Vivekananda. This understanding has been shaped, of course, by the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, the Holy Mother, and Swamiji himself, and the wisdom of the many Swamis and Pravajikas of the Ramakrishna order with whom it has been my honor to associate through the years. I don't want to forget anyone, but I do want to mention a few names. I want to especially note the guidance of my own guru in this regard. I would like to acknowledge the work and the talks of our very own Swami Sarvapriyananda, who is here with us today. So often when I'm speaking, it's when he's not here, so I'm very, very happy to have his presence here with us today. And I've been inspired by so many teachers in the Ramakrishna order. Pravajika Vrajaprana, a very dear friend of mine, Pravajika Gayatri Prana, Swami Atmagyanananda from our DC center, which is our nearest center to where I live. And my very good friend Swami Medhananda. And in fact, I would like to recommend his most recent book, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism. There are a few areas that I touch upon today, and he goes into those into much greater depth. And I highly recommend that book. And his earlier book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion. So all of these wonderful people have really shaped my understanding of the topics I'm going to share with you. Finally, my perspective has also been shaped by the teachings of the great sages, the rishis and arhats, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the prophets and saints, and the philosophers and theologians of the world's traditions, which it's been my very deep privilege to study in this lifetime. I'm mentioning all these people and expressing my gratitude so that I can avoid the false and immodest claim that what I'm sharing with you today is entirely my own. It's not. However, any errors that I commit today, I can claim those. Those are mine. So the question I'm posing today is one I've been thinking about for a very, very long time. What makes the four yogas work? It's well known that according to Swami Vivekananda, the 4 yogas, Karma Yoga, the yoga of selfless action, Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of loving devotion, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, and Raja Yoga or Dhyana Yoga, the yoga of meditation, are effective and independent paths to what is variously termed God realization, self-realization with a capital S, enlightenment, salvation, or liberation, that is, moksha. My question is, what is the mechanism by which these 4 distinct sets of practices bring about their shared goal, the same goal? Answering this question requires us to delve into the nature of realization itself. What is it that is being realized? Who is realizing it? From what are we being liberated? And to what are we being liberated? That is, if our current state is one of bondage, what would it mean to be free? Of what does that freedom consist for which we are striving? To answer these questions, we need to understand how we became bound in the first place. This will take us back to the mystery of creation itself. Why is there anything at all? In particular, why do we exist as we do now in the kind of universe in which we find ourselves? So the first section of my remarks I'd like to turn to now is the emergence of the many from the one. A quick note about creation. When we speak of creation in the Vedantic sense, we're not referring to a specific moment in time, a beginning point at which reality as we know it started. In the traditions of India, as in those of many other parts of the world, it's understood that creation is an ongoing process. Creation is happening right now, at this very moment. We tell stories about it as something that happened long ago because we're accustomed to thinking and speaking within our current frame of reference, which is shaped by the phenomena of time, space, and causation. We therefore think in terms of things having a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we tend to understand things through narratives that are shaped in just this way. The Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions all invite us, however, in various ways, to think differently and to see our linear narrative way of constructing reality as just one frame of reference, one possible way of organizing what we know. We need, therefore, to understand that this way of thinking, while it's convenient for us, is not necessarily a perfect or complete representation of the nature of reality. So this is why we tell stories of creation. But really we're talking about something that is ongoing, that is happening at this very moment. The Taoist tradition of China, as well as much of contemporary physics, is very much in line with this traditional Indic way of thinking, as is the thought of many modern philosophers. We think of time, space, and causation more and more as something that is a lens through which we view reality, rather than as necessarily reflecting reality. In the Tao Te Ching of the 6th century BCE Chinese sage Lao Tzu, it is said that all that exists emerges from an eternal reality, which Lao Tzu terms the Tao, or the way. He tells us that, quote, the way that can be named or described is not the eternal way. He then says that the nameless, that is, the indescribable, is the origin of the myriad creatures. That, at least, is the English translation of scholar Victor Mayer. In other translations of this text, the phrase the myriad creatures is rendered as the 10,000 things. There are, of course, many, many more than 10,000 things, even in our relatively tiny corner of the universe. The late, great Carl Sagan would remind us there were billions and billions of things in our corner of the universe. But this was how philosophers referred to the phenomenal world in ancient China, as the 10,000 things. Similarly, and roughly during the same time period, the Upanishads, the textual fountainhead of the Vedanta tradition, speak in many places of the emergence of the many from the one. In the 4th section of the 1st chapter of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, for example, it is said that the one became the many by dividing itself into countless beings, playfully suggesting that this was done out of a desire for companionship on the part of the one, or out of fear, which can arise when we are in a state of solitude as the one is, as an utterly unique being. Now, one might object that a perfect being, such as the infinite one from which all beings emerge, would surely not feel emotions like loneliness or fear. The suggestion that the many emerge from the one for reasons such as these points to what an infinite mystery this emergence is. We can only begin to comprehend it by approaching it through the lens of experiences to which we can relate. So, primal experiences like loneliness or fear, as well as love, such as the love of the creative process, which drives an artist to create. Later, after the Upanishadic era, in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, it is affirmed that the one does not literally feel loneliness or fear, nor does it even literally divide itself to become the world. Rather, it only appears to do so. This process of creation through appearance or manifestation is known as Maya, a term which is cognate with our English word magic. Maya is the power of creation, through which the One, the infinite Brahman, the nameless and indescribable Tao, gives rise to and manifests as the manifold world of phenomena, the cosmos which we experience as our reality, and whatever other parallel universes are out there. In the words of Sri Ramakrishna, quote, "Those who realize Brahman find that it is Brahman that has become the universe and its living beings." We ourselves are, of course, manifestations of the one infinite reality, infinite finite centers of an infinite consciousness. This is what it means when the Upanishads state that we are that the true self, the Atman, shares the same nature as and is ultimately identical with Brahman. So, moving now to how the one becomes the many, or appears to become the many, I move on to the process of differentiation and the ego. The process of creation, the Maya by which the one manifests as the many, is a process of differentiation. The infinite one projects from itself the infinitely many. Our sense of individuality is therefore closely bound up with the process of creation itself. As it is described in the Sankhya system of Indian philosophy, we become differentiated from one another and from the rest of the realm of nature, or prakriti, by something called ahankara. Ahankara, which literally means the I maker, I meaning the personal pronoun I, not this I, is the mechanism by which we come to perceive ourselves as individual beings, distinct from one another and from the rest of the cosmos. The Latin equivalent of ahankara, which has found its way into the English language as well, is ego. And analogously with ego, ahankara or ahankar has come to refer in modern Indic languages such as Hindi to pride or to an excessive attachment to our individuality, as if it were the most important thing in the world, overriding even our sense of compassion and empathy for other beings, right? We say such a person is egotistical, right? They have a big ego. This ego, importantly, is not our real identity. We are not prakriti, but purusha, or spirit, a term which is more or less equivalent to the Atman of Vedanta. This is our first clue to the answer to our prime question. What makes the four yogas work? Might the yogas have something to do with pointing us beyond the ego and back to our original nature? Individuality itself is not an evil thing. Indeed, it's integral to the process by which the one infinite reality has manifested itself as this wonderful universe. Individuality, we could say, is an essential element of the divine plan. The question is often raised, why does the infinite one choose to appear as the many? If it is already perfect and self-sufficient, what need does it have to manifest itself as the myriad beings making up the cosmos, as us, with all of our problems and all of our suffering? Many answers to this question are, of course, possible, and all of them probably bear some truth. We've already heard the suggestions that the one was lonely or fearful, or that the one simply loves to create. This last suggestion, would suggest that the cosmos is the divine lila, or play, and that the infinite one simply takes delight in manifesting and experiencing itself as all of us, the beings which constitute this vast universe. One also sometimes hears the speculation that as the ground of all being, and as consisting of infinite being, consciousness, and bliss, anantaram satchit anandam, the one needs to divide itself into the many in order fully to become what it is in its pure infinite potential. Consciousness is an experience, and thus requires one who is conscious, and one of whom one is conscious, a subject and an object. Bliss or joy is an experience, and thus requires an enjoyer and that which is enjoyed. So the one becomes the object of its own awareness by dividing into infinite centers of awareness, us. Similarly, it literally enjoys itself by becoming in the same way infinite centers of enjoyment, again, us. As non-dualism teaches us, the consciousness and bliss which make up the one are in reality non-dual and without subject and object. But when the veil of Maya, the matrix of space, time, and causation is projected onto them, they manifest as infinite beings, striving for infinite consciousness and infinite bliss. Yet another answer is that this entire process is a mystery with no rational answer. It cannot be known with the finite mind, but only realized or experienced directly, as we ourselves are the one which has manifested as these myriad beings. The problem with individuality is not that it's bad, but it is a kind of self-forgetting on the part of the Infinite One. It involves a sense of being cut off from, of being other than our true self, and a corresponding alienation from our fellow centers of consciousness, our fellow beings. Part of the process of the one's self-manifestation as this vast cosmos is this very sense of self-alienation. It is this alienation from our true self, our entrapment in what becomes the prison of the ego, which we instinctively wish to overcome. This is the essence of what we refer to as our sense of bondage, a bondage that we wish to overcome. We experience this mumukshutva, this desire for freedom, initially as a desire for happiness and freedom from unhappiness. In the words of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the purpose of life is to be happy. My late father-in-law was also very fond of this expression, the purpose of life is to be happy. One is, of course, free to disagree, but I'm firmly convinced that this is true, that in fact, everyone wants to be happy. One could, of course, point to people who seem to enjoy being unhappy. I would argue, though, that it is this unhappiness that makes them happy, at least in the short term. They like that on some level, right? They're drawn to it. We all do the things we do because we want to be happy. We can act either for immediate happiness, immediate gratification, or we can act for our long-term happiness, sometimes by taking on very difficult work and maybe a lot of short-term unhappiness, or at least discomfort, in the name of this longer-term, more enduring happiness. This is true whether our aim be material or spiritual, whether we're aiming for what I would call the true and lasting happiness of realizing our oneness with the infinite, or for a finite goal like getting a raise or a promotion at work or an Olympic medal, winning an award in the field we've chosen to pursue, or earning the friendship and affection of others whose love we crave. Whatever our goal is, we strive for it because we aspire to be happy, and we think that achieving that will give us happiness. In reply to the possible objection that the idea that happiness is our fundamental motivation in life sounds selfish, I would respond that the objection presumes that it's possible to be really and truly happy when others are unhappy. I would like to submit that this is not the case, for reasons which should hopefully become clear very soon. While it's true that many people do pursue happiness at the expense of others, or even appear to be happiest precisely when they're making others unhappy, and I'm thinking maybe extreme cases of cruelty and so on, I would like to suggest that this is a very early and immature approach to happiness in terms of the soul's journey. For as the soul's journey unfolds, we find that our own happiness is ultimately bound up with the happiness of all beings. We all wish to be happy, but because of our alienation from our true self and our sense of otherness from the rest of creation and what we mistakenly take to be other beings, we typically don't know how to go about being happy. The most obvious source of happiness is, of course, the gratification of the senses. I see something beautiful, I hear some good music, I eat a nice meal, and I'm happy. This, however, is the most temporary source of happiness. It lasts only as long as there's contact between our senses and their objects, or as a memory of such contact. If we think in terms of the purusharthas, the aims of life described in ancient Hindu texts, this form of happiness, or kama, not to be confused with karma, which we'll talk about in a bit, kama is the most ephemeral, the most fleeting form of happiness. A life spent solely in pursuit of sensory gratification is a life in which we experience brief moments of happiness, interspersed with moments in which we're anticipating the next moment of happiness, nostalgically recalling previous moments of happiness, or feeling frustrated because the next moment of happiness is not coming soon enough. This is, we could say, an immature state of being. And we've all been there, right? We're not saying these are the immature people, these are the mature people. We've all passed through this journey, right? So this is, again, not because sensory gratification is an inherently bad thing. Not at all. Indeed, any happiness we experience, even sensory pleasure, is a glimmer of the infinite happiness of the one we are seeking, of Brahman. But sensory pleasure is the most limited form of happiness, and one that easily leads to unhappiness when we do not get what we want. Indeed, the Buddha referred to all temporary forms of happiness as being in truth a form of unhappiness, as suffering or dukkha in the First Noble Truth. If we follow the scheme of the Purusharthas, we know that a more enduring happiness can be found if we work hard and achieve the means for enjoying the senses on a reliable and regular basis, by acquiring artha, which means power or wealth. In fact, this dual meaning of artha as both power and wealth is quite ingenious, as it conveys the idea that in this world, wealth is a type of power. If I have $1, I have the ability, the power, to acquire $1's worth of goods that can give me happiness. This is, of course, temporary happiness, and in today's world, what $1 will get you is not a whole lot, right? But if I have $100, I have 100 times more power to acquire what I want, and so on, and so on. The same problem, though, that attaches to sensory enjoyment also attaches to money and power. In the words of the famous phrase, "You can't take it with you." Even the wealthiest person in the world is not able to carry that wealth into the next life, right? When you were born, you didn't have a bank account from your past life that was immediately transferred to your new self so you could keep on enjoying. No, it just does. You leave that, it's gone. In fact, I just quickly want to narrate something very wise that my grandfather said as he knew he was nearing his death. And he was suffering from a variety of health problems, and he was very involved in various businesses. And he was once asked by my mother, what are you going to do with what's going to happen to all of that when you're gone? And he said, well, it'll just go by the wayside like everything else. He wouldn't care. He wouldn't be there anymore. Someone else would have to deal with it, right? You can't take it with you. Also, as we evolve in our spiritual journey across many lifetimes, we realize the happiness money can yield is, like sense pleasure itself, a temporary thing. Money and power have more utility than a single object of sense gratification because they can enable us to come into contact with many such objects. But at a certain point, we start to realize that the deeper longings of our being are simply not satisfied by material things at all. It is noteworthy in this regard that suicide rates tend to be the highest in parts of the world that are the wealthiest. We need something much greater than either sensory gratification or the means of acquiring it. And when we can't conceive of anything beyond that, it is truly a desperate situation. Higher than both of these, in the traditional scheme of Purusharthas, and typically listed first, is Dharma. In this context, Dharma refers to duties toward others. Contrary to what our sense of alienation may compel us to believe, we are not alone in this world. We live amongst the myriad beings who are all manifestations of the same infinite reality, which is the source and essence of our own existence. True and lasting happiness is therefore not to be found in isolation. It involves the happiness of others as well. Even the solitary sage, who does withdraw from the world and seeks liberation alone on a mountaintop, nevertheless works for the good of all living beings. This work may manifest as an invisible influence on the world, but it is nevertheless real. Swami Vivekananda speaks of this when he says, quote, "The greatest men in the world have passed away unknown. Hundreds of these unknown heroes have lived in every country working silently. Silently they live and silently they pass away. And in time their thoughts find expression in Buddhas or Christs. And it is these latter that become known to us." As we continue to evolve in our spiritual journey, we start to realize the deep joy that arises from giving joy to others. And unlike material wealth, we start to realize that you can take the fruit of your good deeds, your dharmic actions, with you. And now we come to karma, right? This is the popular concept of good karma. As we shall see, and contrary to popular misconceptions, good karma does not lead to God realization, at least not directly, though it can create the conditions in which realization can occur, such as being born into a spiritual family. But good karma does not lead by itself to true and lasting happiness. I encounter this misconception very often. People think you sort of build up a big pile of good karma and then it reaches a critical mass and pop, you're liberated. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. How does it work? Well, that's what we're going to understand, hopefully. So why does karma not by itself lead to this ultimate happiness? This is because the good that comes from doing good from dharma is also bound by time. It's temporary. It lasts longer than material pleasures, but it's still temporary. This is something the sages of the Upanishads realized long ago, and it's why we find criticism of various rituals that are meant to lead to finite goods, such as rebirth in heaven, in texts like the Mundaka Upanishad and the Bhagavad Gita. They basically say, yes, if you perform this ritual in the right way, it'll give you this particular fruit, and by the way, that is utterly worthless if you're looking for moksha. Right? It's very clear about that. It's not that good karma and the works that produce it are bad, any more than sensory objects and wealth are bad. Right? None of these things are bad. They're all manifestations of the infinite. They're not inherently evil, but they are finite. So attachment to them produces at best finite happiness, which means you also get a lot of unhappiness. In order to experience the results of good actions, we have to keep acting again and again and again. It's only with the fourth Purushartha, the fourth goal of life, moksha or liberation, that one experiences a joy which is infinite and unending, in the realization of our own true nature, which we have forgotten through being trapped in the shell of our egoistic individuality. So this is the problem that we're in. So now, at last, we come to the four yogas. How then do we reach moksha? How do we achieve God realization? The realization of our true infinite self, which has manifested in the form of our limited individuality. First, as we were just saying, realization is not a result of action. Again, good karma does not lead to it, at least not directly. If realization were the product of action, it would be limited, as all products of action are. You would do the thing that brings moksha, and you'd have moksha for a while, and then you'd have to do it again. Right? You would have to keep doing whatever you did to achieve it in order to sustain it. It would not be the lasting happiness which it in fact is. It would simply be a more refined version of good karma. And if you look at the life story of the Buddha, this is what he discovered in the course of his journey. Many practices that led to very refined states of consciousness, but they had to be repeated in order for that experience to keep happening. Secondly, if realization is not a result of action, and this I think is the most radical thing I'm going to say today, this means that we literally can do nothing to achieve it. To refer again to the Taoist tradition, the sage Lao Tzu recommends something called Wu Wei, which literally means doing nothing. Now, this isn't just sitting and doing nothing. As Lord Krishna points out in the Bhagavad Gita, it's literally impossible to do nothing. Particularly as beings who identify with physical bodies, we find that even if we try to be very, very still, we nevertheless continue to breathe, our bodily processes continue to operate, and similarly our minds continue to be active even if we sit still. It takes great effort to still the mind, a process which the Gita compares to taming the wind. Even the Lord himself, the Infinite One, acts constantly to uphold the world, a process called lokasangraha, right? The upholding of our existence. Doing nothing, then, does not mean literally doing nothing. As Lord Krishna explains in the 3rd chapter of the Gita, it means acting without a sense of doership, acting with detachment. We still appear to be acting, but that agent is gone. It is realizing that it is the Infinite One who is in fact the doer of all action. All that occurs in all the myriad universes of existence is the action, the manifestation of the only one who in the end really does exist, the Infinite Brahman. Even the Infinite Brahman, when we remove this veil of time, space, and causation, is not in fact acting, because once you remove that veil, there's nothing happening at all. It is just pure infinity. But I'm speaking within this realm, all action, everything is the action of the infinite. To act without that sense of doership, not out of attachment to the fruits of one's actions, out of a desire for temporary happiness, but for the good of all beings, is to surrender one's sense of doership to the divine reality, to step aside and let the Divine Mother, the Tao, the Infinite Brahman, work through us. Right? In the words of St. Francis of Assisi, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. We become an instrument of God. To quote from the Star Wars films, let the Force flow through you. Or to paraphrase the Apostle Paul, it is not I who acts, but Christ who acts through me. This surrender of one's sense of doership and of allowing the Infinite One to work through us is thus central to the process of attaining realization and liberation, and brings us very close to the answer to our question, what makes the 4 yogas work? Recall that at the fountainhead of the process by which the One manifests as the many, as all of us myriad beings, is the phenomenon of individuation, the arising of the ahankara, the ego. It is this ego that gives rise to our sense of individuality, this wonderful individuality that enables us to see reality from a unique perspective and to cultivate the special gifts which we can in turn give back to the world. But it is the same individuality which, if we remain caught up in it, if we become attached to it, alienates us from others and from our true self and gives rise to all our suffering. The 4 yogas work. Here's the answer, right? The 4 yogas work by attenuating, by reducing this sense of individuality. When we are egotistical, if we're caught up in our individual desires without regard for others and see ourselves as being cut off from the rest of existence or as standing above it, our ego, we can say, is opaque. The light of the infinite reality that is its true source is getting through to us only dimly, like sunlight concealed by a thick black smoke. But as we open the ego to others and to the infinite, as we let it unfold like a flower, it starts to become translucent. More and more light comes in. We feel an increasingly sustainable sense of happiness and real joy in our lives, even in the midst of unfortunate circumstances. And when the ego becomes completely transparent, such that there is no visible barrier whatsoever between I, the individual, and I, the infinite, then realization has been achieved. The One shines through like the sun on a clear and bright day, until eventually it is all that we see and all that we are. The 4 yogas function to achieve this very translucency and ultimate transparency of the ego. Swami Vivekananda sees these yogas not as mutually exclusive, but as mutually affirming. There are 4 yogas, and not only one, to suit 4 basic personality types: emotional, intellectual, active, and contemplative. And each of us is some mix of all 4 of those. In Swamiji's own words, quote, we classify the yogas in the following way under 4 heads. Karma yoga, the manner in which a man realizes his own divinity through works and duty. 2, bhakti yoga, the realization of the divinity through devotion to and love of a personal God. Raja yoga, the realization of the divinity through the control of the mind. and 4, Jnana Yoga, the realization of a man's own divinity through knowledge. I firmly believe that if Swami Vivekananda were speaking today, he would have spoken of human beings, humanity. He uses the term man because that's how people spoke and wrote in the 1890s. So give him a break. He's talking about all of us, right? We don't need to cancel Swami Vivekananda, right? Because he said man, right? Ultimately, there are, according to Swami Vivekananda, as many yogas as there are individual beings seeking liberation. We can think of the 4 yogas as 4 clusters of practices, and the yoga of each individual as a highly specific combination of these practices, unique to the individual personality. The classification of the yogas as 4 in number is thus a matter of convenience, done for the sake of typology. It's not meant to be restrictive, to imply that there are 4 and only 4 ways to realize God, nor are the yogas to be seen as mutually exclusive. Right? We need a convenient number. If we say there are infinite yogas, we say, okay, that doesn't help me, I'm overwhelmed. Right? If we say there's only one, well, now I'm fanatical, like everybody has to do the same thing. 4 is, good, with that kind of asterisk. Among the 4 yogas, Raja Yoga and Jnana Yoga, the yogas of meditation and knowledge, respectively, can sound quite similar, given that both are focused on the mind. The approach of Jnana Yoga, however, is cognitive, the elimination of false identifications of the self, such as with the body or the mind, aimed at giving rise to the certain knowledge, jnana, that the Atman, the self, and Brahman are one. The approach of Raja Yoga is, one could say, more phenomenological. We still our thoughts with the aim of directly realizing our divine nature through the experience of samadhi. In Jnana Yoga, we use the mind to go beyond the mind by negating our dualistic mental constructs. In Raja Yoga, we restrain the mind and still it with the aim of experiencing that which is beyond it. In both these practices, the ego is attenuated. Jnana Yoga does this through its intellectual deconstruction of the ego, the process of neti, I am not this, I'm not that. Raja Yoga does this by quieting the ego, removing one's attention from it. For attention adds fuel to the waves of the mind, stilling the vibrations of the mind and simply allowing the true self to shine through. That is how Raja Yoga accomplishes its goal. This is what the sage Patanjali means when he defines this form of yoga as chitta vritti nirodha, the calming of the waves of the mind. If we attain realization through these methods, we may experience it as an awakening to our own true self, a recovery of an identity that was only apparently lost, but that was in fact there all along. As the Zen tradition teaches, we were always enlightened, we were always free, we just didn't know it yet. Bhakti Yoga, on the other hand, melts the ego, as it were, in divine love. Through opening ourselves up to the Infinite One as a being of infinite love and allowing ourselves to experience our utter dependence on this loving divine reality, the ego's illusion of independence comes to be dissolved, and with it its stranglehold on our consciousness. In the end, the divine beloved, in whatever form it has drawn us to itself, is all that matters. And we're willing to sacrifice even our own sense of self to be nearer to that one who is at the heart of all our deepest aspirations. We give up the ego by giving up even the idea that it is we who liberate ourselves. We allow ourselves to be liberated rather by divine grace. If we get realization through bhakti, we will experience it as a loving union, a communion with the divine beloved, less of a dissolution of self than a completion of self. Now, the visions of realization that I just described in terms of Jnana Yoga and Raja Yoga and Bhakti Yoga, they sound different. They are different, right? And these have sometimes been a topic of debate amongst various traditions, and that one of them is the real realization and that the other is somehow a preliminary step. This is one of the things that Swami Medhananda writes about quite brilliantly, which is that in the teaching of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, that is just not the case. These are all realization. Realization can be experienced in myriad ways. And so one is not better than the other, right? They are, whatever path attracts you, that is your path. Finally, Karma Yoga is living a life of service to the other suffering beings with whom we share the world. This yoga attenuates the ego because it involves our putting the needs of others ahead of our own. As in Bhakti Yoga, our willingness to sacrifice ourselves for others is a sign and an expression of the dissolution of egotism. It is this dissolution of the ego that enables the light of the true self, the infinitely loving, infinitely blissful, infinitely conscious divinity who resides in all beings and in all whom beings reside, to shine forth in its fullness. This is the realization that liberates us from the prison of the ego and enables us to be truly free. For one who attains liberation through karma yoga, it might be experienced as a profound solidarity with all beings, as a restoration of relations among the beings making up the cosmos from whom we had been alienated. The Jewish tradition speaks of tikkun olam, or the repairing of the world, kind of similar to the concept of lokasangraha. We have contributed our whole being to the betterment of the world in which we find ourselves. This is a harmony in which we have surrendered our selfish ego, placing the good of all beings before our own and making it our highest desire. So in conclusion, what makes the four yogas work, the precise mechanism by which they lead to liberation, is through the attenuation and eventual annihilation of the ego as a principle of separation between ourselves and the rest of existence. We move from being centers of selfishness and fear to being centers of love, with our being eventually mingling and becoming one with that of all beings, and with being itself. Whether through intellect, meditation, devotion, service, or some unique combination of all four. Thus do we move, in the words of the Upanishads, from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. Thank you all very much.
If you have a question, could you raise your hand and Jeffrey will call on you, and then we'll ask you to come up to the front and pose your question here and just state your name. So this gentleman here. Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Terry.
Hi, Terry.
Thank you for the very clear presentation. A practical question. As we are all mixed types, how does one assess which yoga or which proportion of yogas is best for one's own progress and enlightenment?
Okay, that is a wonderful question. How do we assess, how do we tell which yoga is ours or which combination of yogas and which of these is appropriate? I think that it involves an ongoing process of discernment. I think that ideally one would do this in consultation with a guide, with a mentor, with a guru, someone who knows us very well, has insight into us. It requires complete honesty with oneself. That sometimes is the first difficult achievement, is really, truly understanding ourselves and what we need. I think very often our own intuition can be a guide. You just feel very drawn to a certain practice. So do that practice. It may, I think, change throughout a lifetime. It may be that you need to do a certain practice to work on a certain set of issues and then maybe move to another. That being said, don't flit around amongst practices. Sri Ramakrishna has this wonderful metaphor of someone who dug a bunch of shallow holes in search of water, and if they'd spent all that effort just digging in one place, that they would have found water. Right? So be diligent in a practice. Some of the practices, they're difficult because we are trying to undo literally lifetimes of habits, sanskaras, right? So there can be, for example, in the practice of meditation, long periods where you feel like nothing is happening, right? Maybe you had some very beautiful visionary experience at some point, and then you meditate every day, and it's just like, okay, I'm just sitting here. But things are happening, right? So sticking with it is important. Unless for some reason it becomes simply impossible to do one of these practices, the best thing is to stick with it. But it can change. And again, if you're in consultation with a guide, that's a good way to do it. I heard a Swami once speaking at the Washington, D.C. Center who gave a nice schematic of the 4 yogas in terms of people's inclinations and discerning this. And you can think in terms of it, when you come to the Vedanta Society, what do you enjoy most? So some people come for the lecture, right? So those are the jnana yogis, right? They're looking for knowledge. Some people come and they say, okay, there are a lot of people here. We better start fixing food and getting everything ready. We need to make sure, everyone can put their shoes in the right place. And so they're the sevaks, right? They're the people doing karma yoga. And then you have people, love the beautiful music, the singing, the devotion. It melts their heart. Their eyes fill with tears. Those are bhakti yogis. And then you have the people who come when no one else is here. And they sit in the solitude and meditate. Right? So if you feel one of those people, that's me, that's a good clue to, maybe what is the dominant yoga for you.
Thank you. That's also very clear.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Hello, my name is Tanya. Thank you so much for that. It was so clear and enlightening.
Thank you.
I had a question. We were talking about how the 4 yogas are all equal in value and space. Mm-hmm. Are the 4 aims the same way, or is moksha better or worse than the other 4?
No, there we have very much a hierarchy, where the traditional listing puts dharma first. You have the first 3 we could call laukika, that is worldly aims. So we need to be good, we need to earn a living, and we need to have some fun in life, right? So you have dharma, artha, kama. So in terms of the way I presented them, I did the opposite. I went from the most ephemeral to the more permanent. So sensory pleasure exists while there's contact between the senses and their object. Very ephemeral. Artha lasts longer. You can put it in the bank. You can spend it on different objects of kama, but you can't take it with you. Then you have dharma, which you can take with you. That's your good karma. That's where you're really evolving as a being. Doing your duties, doing good for others. Moksha is transcendent of all of them. It goes beyond them. It's definitely the top goal. That being said, it is not that someone who is maybe fixated or focused on one of the first 3 is bad or wrong. That's where they are in the path. So yesterday I was on my way to New York in my car. When I had reached Philadelphia, I wasn't, somehow traveling to New York wrongly. I just wasn't here yet. Right? So there are people, including ourselves, who might be fixated more on kama, on artha, on dharma. So maybe we have work to do there. Achieving those also does something to our consciousness. It helps prepare us on that way. And then you have that point where we actually conceive of the idea of something utterly transcendent. And that's when you're then focused on moksha. So yeah, there is a hierarchy, but they all have their place in life. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, and while the next person's coming up, to say, even a being in moksha doesn't cease to, say, enjoy the sensory world. They're just not attached to it, right? It comes, it goes, right? But they experience it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Tai. And so you said that the highest goal is moksha, mm-hmm. which I understand. When you are a bhakti yogi, you are there's a union with the divine,
right?
A union with the Ishvara. How is that different than like the absolute goal of Brahman, of union with the Brahma versus union with the Ishvara?
I think they're ultimately the same, but and it's hard to use the word phenomenological here because we're talking about things that are even beyond the senses. So it's very difficult, but they are experientially different, right? That the way one is described, the primary emotion and sensation is love, the primary experience is love, which involves this coming together of the infinite self and the finite self. And then you have, in a state like enlightenment, there's more of an emphasis on the bliss of this realization, a sense of kind of relief that the Maya is gone. And so they're described differently. I think maybe we can liken this to maybe two different people tasting the same dish, right? You have some food, and one person says, oh, this tastes like strawberries. And for someone else, they say, well, maybe this tastes like blueberries. It's the same dish, but their experiencing of it is shaped by how they have approached it. What have they tasted before? What is their point of reference? How do they assess this experience? So that will be different. So the differences are happening on the level of description. I don't want to say that they're that superficial. I mean, the differences are penetrating more deeply than that, but I don't think they penetrate all the way. I say realization is one. Realization is realization. But the means by which you achieve it will shape the way it'll be experienced by you. But it'll still be blissful. It'll still be free from suffering. It'll still be free from mandatory rebirth. I think liberated beings, as I understand it, can choose to come back, but the sort of mandatory, the karmic kind of requirement of rebirth, that is gone. So in all the essentials, they're one and the same. That's how I understand. But yeah, we're getting into very, very subtle levels of difference here. But what I would call a spiritual connoisseur, like Sri Ramakrishna, wanted to have all the flavors of liberation. And so he practiced many different paths, and he had all of those experiences. He concluded they were all one. But that doesn't mean, and this is where it becomes difficult sometimes, we want to pick one of his experiences and say, oh, they were all really leading up to that. But what he says is just, no, they're all one. They're all valid. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Namaskar, Professor Long. Happy to see you here again.
Thank you.
You brought up the concept and topic of ahamkara in your lecture today.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the quotes that I remember Swami Vivekananda spoke, it goes like, the difference between God and the devil is nothing except in unselfishness and selfishness. The devil knows as much as God, is as powerful as God, only he has no holiness. That makes him a devil.
Mm-hmm.
So I was curious to know from your experience, how or your thoughts on how would one avoid this trap of selfishness while practicing any of the four yogas, or even while harmonizing all four yogas?
Mm-hmm. It's very, very difficult. Yeah, how would one avoid the practice of selfishness? Because we've all fallen into it. It's what we're trying to get out of. I think that the key here is cultivating empathy. We're capable of mistreating others when we see them as other, and the more we do that, the more egotistical we become. If you are I'll give you an example of a practice I've followed. I'll confess, I get irritated by the way people drive. They do horrible, stupid things sometimes. And I remember once there was a driver in front of me, and he was nothing he did made sense. He almost caused a couple of accidents, and I was getting really annoyed. And then his car turned, and I could actually see the driver. He was a very elderly man. And I just immediately thought of my own grandfather, the same grandfather I mentioned earlier today, right? And he struggled with his driving as he was getting older. His eyesight was failing, and he shouldn't have been driving, right? We would ask him, like, how do you drive? He said, I just follow the big white blur. That's how he described the road. Frightening, right? I mean, really bad. But I thought, think of that irritating guy that in your mind you're ready to call all kinds of names. Think of him as your own grandfather. And he's like, oh, then you feel compassion for him, right? Rather than being annoyed by his driving, you think, well, I feel empathy for someone who's strong. Like, when I reach that age and I refuse to stop driving, I hope people will be patient with me when I follow the big white blur, right? Mm-hmm. So cultivating that sense of empathy, that I am the other, or that the other is someone very dear to me. So someone who reminds you of someone. I had another experience in a store. There was a person who was behaving in a very snappy and irritable way, and I was a little put off by it, and it wasn't even directed at me. It was directed at someone else. And then I remember thinking, how much unhappiness must that person have to be acting out like that? Maybe something really tragic happened, Maybe they need a hug, right? Mm-hmm. So to reserve our sense of judgment, and that's very difficult. Because judgment's important on one level. We have to be judgmental with ourselves, right? So we don't do the wrong thing. And the Holy Mother here, I think, is our greatest teacher. She says, if you want to find true happiness in life, don't find fault with others. Find it only with yourself. And I think that's the key. That reduces the ego very, very quickly. Because it transforms that form of irritation. How dare they do that to me? To compassion. How can I help them? Right? That they are, like that. And, you might not actually, it might be very quick interaction. It might be, you might not even be interacting at all. You might be observing something. But through that experience, you sort of learn to start working on that. And yes, it can be difficult. It can be very difficult. You can be like in the workplace, for example. I've had the experience of being in a meeting with people and, you're explaining something. You think you've explained it clearly, and you're listening to their point of view, and but they're not understanding. You think they're not understanding you, and they sort of persist in their, their way of thinking. But then you realize you can also be that way. One of the funniest cartoons I ever saw, a friend of mine sent me this one. There's a man sitting up late at night. You could just it's 3 a.m. and his eyes are all wild looking and his hair's disheveled and he's on his computer. And his wife comes in and she says, "Are you coming to bed?" And he said, "Not yet. Someone on the internet is wrong." and he's there writing to them, And, we become obsessed with the idea that we know it all and the other person's, they're wrong, they're bad. And just to even laugh at ourselves and replace that with compassion. I think that's extremely important.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for the great questions. I appreciate everyone coming today and listening and,
Thank you. My name's Paritosh. In the Gita, Shri Krishna says, "None is hateful to me, none is dear to me, but I am in them, but they are not in me, and that's why they suffer." Mm-hmm. What does that mean?
What does that mean? I've struggled with that one, right? Because we do talk about God being within others and within ourselves, and there's that verse in the Gita where exactly Sri Krishna says, "They are in me, and I am not in them," right? And in a literal sense, if we think in terms of the doctrine of panentheism, right, that we are all in God and God is in all of us, that would cause us to pause for a moment and say, well, why does he say that I am not in them? And my understanding of that, and I've read several different commentaries on the Gita to try to get at the heart of this, and there's the thread of agreement that I see there is that that if we speak of God as being in us in a limiting sense, right, that God is part of us, like an internal organ or something of that sort, that is ruled out. It's like that God is in us in the same way that the atmosphere is in us, right? It's all pervasive. That God is not in any way limited by the divine presence dwelling within us. So God is not in us in any kind of conventional sense that would cause God to be limited. In other words, to make it a little simpler, if I say God is within you, that doesn't mean God is not anywhere else, right? So we're not talking about God in a limited sense. So Krishna is saying, I'm not limited at all. They're limited because they're failing to see that divine presence. But, the reality is that he's not limited at all.
Thank you.
Swami Sarvapriyananda is here. Am I getting it right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So
Thank you.
Different interpretations.
Yeah, very good.
Anybody else?
Any other questions? I think everyone's asked their questions, so
Okay.
thank you all. Thank you.
Jeffrey, thank you so much again, as always.
Thank you, Diane.
Do come again.
Thank
very
you,
soon.
Diane. Thank you, and thank you,
Thank
Swami.
you.
Thank you.
Seeing as it's Easter, we're going to have just a little Easter celebration, and Paula